about, I don't think anybody could find a more knowledgeable person about the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research than Sam Norich. This is our 100th anniversary, and Sam's been here for probably almost half of it. And I think that he is one of the key people why YIVO is still an independent organization. My guess is Sam will touch upon this in his lecture, but the institution is the largest archive of Eastern European Jewish material in the world. It is a phenomenal institution, and we are a sub-organization to YIVO. We are part of the National YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Sam, it's all to you now.
Thanks, Jake. In my book, when Jake Marowitz calls, nennt man die Viehs auf der Plätze und man kommt zu laufen. For those who aren't yet fluent in Yiddish, that translates to, when Jake Marowitz calls, you come a-running. So when Jake asked me to give this talk, I didn't hesitate. Jake and I have been YIVO Patrioten for most of our adult lives, and we came by it honestly. We are both sons of the Sheres HaPleite, of the saving remnant of European Jewry, born a few years after the Churban, the Holocaust, was over, to parents who had survived by a series of miracles. The fact that we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the founding of YIVO this year is also one of the miracles of Jewish history. YIVO, too, was part of the Sheres HaPleite. It was founded in 1925, in the same year as the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and for parallel purposes. The Hebrew University was to be the academic center for the Zionist movement, with Hebrew as the main language, while YIVO was founded to be the academic center for the diaspora nationalist movement, with Yiddish as the main language. In the years immediately after the end of World War I, after the Versailles Agreements establishing minority rights in the newly independent states of Eastern Europe, the prospects for diaspora nationalism must have seemed more realistic, more plausible than the prospects for a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael, even with the Balfour Declaration. After all, the diaspora accounted for the vast majority of the Jewish people, and Yiddish was what most of them spoke, in addition usually to other languages. Most of the world's Jews traced their ancestry to what had historically been the Polish lands of Eastern Europe. They had a common culture based in Torah and rabbinic law that prescribed in fine detail how one was to live in the world, and even the secularists among them, who had freed themselves from rabbinic guidance, had been deeply influenced by prophetic teachings about social justice and communal solidarity. Of course, events took a turn for the worse right after 1925, with the rise of right-wing and fascist regimes in Europe, leading in the 1940s to the annihilation of most of European Jewry. Let's not forget that for the last 85 of these 100 years, YIVO has been an American institution, serving an American Jewish community. Once the East European Jewish Center had been destroyed by the Nazis, being the academic research arm of the diaspora nationalist movement could no longer be YIVO's main mission. It became instead the institution charged with snatching embers from the fire, the institution charged with studying, teaching, and reminding succeeding generations of the long tail of East European Jewish history and culture and its continuing salience in our own lives. We've seen 3 generations since YIVO's move to America, 4 generations in some families, and YIVO has found ways to meet the needs of today for a growing community of scholars and students, audiences for its lectures, conferences, webinars, exhibitions, publications, and performances, for musicians, foodies, genealogists, and Stam Yidden, just plain Jews, and non-Jews. Thanks to its inspired lay and professional leadership, YIVO today is on a stronger financial footing than it has ever been. And with the rise of anti-Semitism in recent years, it can enrich and enliven the Jewish identification even of those who may be reluctant to show publicly that they are Jews. An anniversary is a good occasion to look back at what has brought us to this day, what threats and calamities YIVO has had to overcome, what achievements have marked its trajectory and brought us to where we are today. Despite the worsening political realities in Poland and in Europe, YIVO managed during its first 15 years to establish itself as a center of scholarship, to attract and engage many of the leading historians, economists, writers, and literary scholars of the day, to collect a library and archives documenting the literature, culture, and living conditions of contemporary Jewry, to mobilize thousands of Sammlers, collectors, not only in Poland, but in some 30 Jewish communities all over Europe, North and South America, and South Africa. Sammlers who would send locally published books, leaflets, placards, and small donations to YIVO's headquarters in Vilna. It published the research organized and carried out by its sections. The philological section for the study of language, literature, and folklore, headed by Max Weinreich and based in Vilna. The historical and economic statistical section, headed by Elias Cherikover and Jacob Leschinski, based in Berlin and after 1933 in Paris, and the psychological pedagogical section in Warsaw. It was constantly facing financial constraints, with most of its funds raised by the Amoptail, the American section, headquartered in New York, according to Cecile Kuznets in her entry on YIVO in the magisterial YIVO Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe, which you can access free of charge at YIVO's website on your own computer. In 1933, YIVO moved into an impressive, capacious building it had bought and renovated on a tree-lined street outside the old center of the Vilna Jewish community, and held an international conference there in 1935 to celebrate its 10th anniversary that attracted Marc Chagall, Shimon Dubnov, and Peretz Hirschbein, among many others. YIVO had close ties to the Yiddish primary and secondary schools in Vilna, held conferences and training programs for their teachers who applied and taught the standardized grammatical and orthographic rules promulgated by YIVO scholars. And as I've mentioned, YIVO had, from its first days, close ties with Jewish emigres from Eastern Europe living in the US. Indeed, Max Weinreich, YIVO's research director, spent the 1932-33 academic year at Yale University, supported by a fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation, to take part in a seminar led by Edward Sapir on the effects of culture on personality. That seminar led Weinreich on his return to Vilna to issue a call to Jewish teens to write their autobiographies and send them to YIVO. The many hundreds of autobiographies YIVO received have been the focus of a number of studies in the decades since, starting with Weinreich's own volume, Der Weg zu unserer Jugend, The Road to Our Youth, published in 1935. The other major achievement of YIVO in the 1930s was the creation of the Aspirantur in 1934, the graduate training program, which attracted advanced students from far and wide, including Lucy Schildkraut, later known as Lucy Davidovich. In 1989, she published a book from that time and place, a memoir of the academic year she spent studying at YIVO in Vilna in 1938-39. When Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland in September 1939, Weinreich happened to be in Denmark on his way to an international linguistics conference. He was instructed not to return to Vilna, but to go on to New York, together with his older son, Uriel. He was joined in New York by his wife, Regina, and younger son, Gabriel, a year later. In New York, Weinreich resumed the work he had done in Vilna, and as it became clear in the years that followed that he would not be able to return to Vilna, he recreated YIVO's headquarters in New York. At first, YIVO was given 2 rooms in the Hayas building, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society building, on Lafayette Street in Greenwich Village, the building that is today the Public Theater. In 1942, the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Louis Finkelstein, gave YIVO the building at 535 West 123rd Street that the seminary owned, and that was YIVO's home for the next 13 years. I know this from Ruth Messenger, the former borough president of Manhattan, and later the longtime leader of the American Jewish World Service. Her mother had been Louis Finkelstein's secretary in the 1940s and had worked on the transfer of the building to YIVO. In the early 1940s, YIVO was the first organization to bring the news of the catastrophe that had befallen European Jewry to the American Jewish community. As Cecile Kuznets reminds us in the YIVO Encyclopedia, in 1944, quote, it published a brochure on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as well as the last article by Emanuel Ringelblum, whose leadership of the Oyneg Shabbos archive in the Warsaw Ghetto was clearly inspired by his work for YIVO's historical section, unquote. That work continued in Poland and the displaced persons camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy immediately after the end of the war, organized by a group under the leadership of Philip Friedman, who collected eyewitness accounts from Jewish survivors of the Nazi ghettos and concentration camps. The Jewish documentary evidence that YIVO collected became an essential foundation for research on the Holocaust ever since. The most startling work of pulling embers from the fire came during the war years themselves. I'm referring to the work of the so-called Paper Brigade in Vilna itself. Paper brigade was a term of deprecation coined by inhabitants of the Vilna ghetto, who saw these intellectuals working in the YIVO building smuggling paper into the Vilna ghetto instead of smuggling potatoes and other food. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the Nazi organization responsible for pilfering some 3 million books, tens of thousands of artworks, and archival collections from libraries, museums, and private collections in every country conquered by the Germans, had designated the YIVO building as the sorting point for such collections from all over Lithuania. Jewish intellectuals fluent in multiple languages were forced by the Nazis to go through YIVO's own collections, as well as the collections of other libraries and research institutions brought into the YIVO building, to select what the Nazis wanted for their planned post-war Institute for Research on the Jewish Question. Despite almost constant oversight by German soldiers, the 24 members of the Paper Brigade, led by poets Avram Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczynski, managed to snatch and hide many of the most valuable items, conceal some in the attic of the YIVO building, smuggle others into the Vilna ghetto, where they stashed them in basements or gave them to friendly Gentiles for safekeeping. Tens of thousands of books and documents were shipped by the Nazis to Frankfurt, and still more were pulped. In 1943, the YIVO building was destroyed, but Sutzkever and Kaczynski survived in Soviet Russia, and when Vilna was liberated by the Red Army in July 1944, they returned and retrieved the rare books and documents they had saved. They brought these saved items into the short-lived Museum of Jewish Art and Culture created under the Soviet Lithuanian regime. Within a couple of years, they came to realize that the rare items they had saved were not safe under the new regime, and they began to smuggle books and documents out to YIVO in New York or to Western Europe. They fled Vilna soon after, Sutzkever to Israel and Kaczynski to Argentina. The Jewish Museum in Vilna was closed by the regime in 1949, together with all other Jewish cultural institutions, and the valuable documentary collections it held were transferred to the Lithuanian National Book Chamber, where their fate remained unknown to the outside world for the next half-century. Meanwhile, in New York, YIVO pursued its work with feverish intensity. I once came across a memo Weinreich had written to the board of YIVO in January 1944, regretting that because of the difficulties brought on by the war, the Institute had managed during the previous year to publish only 4,000 pages of original research. How was that even possible? They did it. Among the publications of those years was a landmark 2-volume history of the Jewish labor movement in the United States. YIVO issued another call for people to write their autobiographies, this time asking older immigrants to recount the noteworthy moments in their lives. It published multiple issues of the journal Yiddish Sprach, as well as the English language YIVO Annual of Jewish Social Studies. In 1946, Weinreich published Hitler's Professors, demonstrating that it was the cream of German science and scholarship, not a bunch of crackpots who had conceived and overseen the Nazi campaign to destroy European Jewry. In 1949, YIVO published Uriel Weinreich's College Yiddish, the standard text for Yiddish language learning ever since. Between 1960 and 1978, it published, together with Yad Vashem, 15 volumes of Holocaust bibliographies. In the decades immediately after the end of the war, YIVO's work was done primarily by people raised and educated in Eastern Europe who had survived the Churban and the Holocaust and had made their way to New York. People like Weinreich himself, Elias Cherikover, Jacob Leschinski, Isaiah Trunk, Raphael Mahler, Lucianda Bershitsky, Shlomo Noble, Dina Abramovich, Hannah Frischdorf, Yadja Zeltman, Shoshka Ehrlich, David Rogov. One by one, they went the way of all flesh over the ensuing decades. Weinreich died in 1969, 2 years after his son Uriel had died, but managed, before he died, to complete the two most important projects of his life. He finished writing his magnum opus, the Geschichte von der Jiddischer Sprache, the history of the Yiddish language, which YIVO published in Yiddish in 4 volumes, 2 volumes of text and 2 of footnotes in 1973, and the University of Chicago Press published in English translation of the text volumes alone in 1980. Second, he managed to establish the Center for Advanced Jewish Studies in 1968 to train graduate students at accredited universities in Yiddish literature and linguistics, folklore, history, and social studies. The Uriel Weinreich program in Yiddish language and culture was created in 1968 as well, and was the first intensive Yiddish language program which has since been copied in many places. With the Uriel Weinreich program functioning much like an undergraduate major, as an entry ramp for Yiddish studies, and with the Max Weinreich Center giving advanced students the course training and dissertation supervision to complete their doctorates, YIVO trained many of the scholars who have been the senior figures in the field over the last few decades. And I'm proud to say that my sister, Anita Norich, was one of them, is one of them. The decade Yitzalangiyo. The decade following Weinreich's death was a period of decline in many ways. It was not only the absence of Weinreich's dominant intellectual leadership and personality. Other key figures died during that decade as well. In the late 1970s, fully 45% of YIVO's budget came from a single source: grants for archival arrangement and microfilming from the National Endowment for the Humanities. As those grants declined according to plan from year to year, YIVO's own fundraising was supposed to replace them, but it didn't. Consequently, YIVO's budget went from some $960,000 in 1976 to $640,000 in 1979. When I came in as executive director on January 2nd, 1980, the only way was up. My first task was to write an application for a challenge grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which I did in the first 6 weeks with the help of Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblet and Ricky Lieberman, a friend of a friend who was then responsible for special projects at New York Federation. That application was successful, but we didn't get the first grant funds until December of that year. I remember that YIVO staff were paid late all through that year, some 2 or 3 weeks late, some with much longer delays. I remember receiving my May salary at the end of November. It was something YIVO staff, who were never paid munificently, had experienced many times before, but after 1980, it never happened again. Over the course of the 1980s, we managed to resume YIVO's scholarly publications, which had been delayed for years because of budgetary constraints, including the YIVO Annual, YIVO Blätter, and Yiddish Sprache. We issued a call for photos of Jewish life in Russia and the Soviet Union over the past century. And in 1988, we mounted a large exhibition at the Jewish Museum of New York and published a book of those photos, curated and authored by Tzvi Gittleman of the University of Michigan. But the principal achievement of that decade was the engagement of a younger and more affluent, largely American-born constituency to support YIVO's work. We did that with a much expanded series of public programs that found an avid audience and interest from the press, especially the New York Times. We got a donation from the Weinstein family in Madison, Wisconsin in 1982 to support the YIVO Sound Archives, which, together with the invaluable work of Chana Mlotek, our music archivist, became a wellspring that fed the growing interest and repertoires of klezmer musicians the world over. And of course, we founded KlezCamp in 1985, led by Henry Sapoznik and Adrian Cooper, Alea Shalom. Beginning with the premiere of the films Image Before My Eyes in 1981 and Yentl in 1983, we held fundraising galas annually. We had the good fortune of even being adopted by theater impresario Joseph Papp, who produced a program of musical theater for our YIVO galas almost every year from 1984 to his death until his death in 1991, with stars of the Broadway stage performing for and honoring in turn Neil Simon, Stella Adler, and Papp himself. We also managed to attract a number of younger scholars to YIVO staff, including Jack Kugelmass, Jenna Weissman-Josselit, Deborah Dash Moore, and David Fishman, each of whom has made important contributions to their fields. We brought a number of new supporters to YIVO's board, including Tony Greenberg, Helen Nash, Bruce Lovin, Motl Zelmanovich, and Lawrence Weinstein. Zelmanovich helped us arrange for the acquisition of the Bund archives in 1992. Slovin, who had been Ron Perelman's right hand in the acquisition of one company after another, became chair of the YIVO board in 1990, and he brought us to a whole new level of support for our benefit events from his many contacts in the New York business community. But the development that garnered the most headlines and the most attention from scholars and from the public was our reestablished contact in 1989 with the YIVO library and archival collections that had remained in Vilna. The YIVO materials that the Nazis stole from Vilna during the war were located by the monuments men after the conquest of Germany in a town called Offenbach, a suburb of Frankfurt. And with the help of the US military and that of Lucy Davidovich, who spent a year going through those collections in 1946-47 to identify YIVO materials, they were sent to New York in 1947. But the collections that had remained in Vilna, with which we had no further contact for half a century, were feared destroyed. It turned out that those collections had not been destroyed under the Soviets, but were actually hidden and saved by Lithuanian librarians at the risk of their lives. In 1988, on my first trip to Poland, to open the Image Before My Eyes exhibition at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, I was told to come to the Warsaw home of Stefan Bergman, the historian, at a certain date and time. There I met Emanuel Zingeris, a young graduate student in Vilna, who told me that he had encountered many YIVO books and documents in the course of his research in Lithuanian libraries, and promised he would send for me to come to Vilna when the time was right. In January 1989, he did. He asked me to come to the founding conference of the Jewish Cultural Society of Lithuania the following month. While there, and I was there together with Marek Webb, YIVO's chief archivist, he brought us to meet the director of the Lithuanian National Book Chamber, who showed us 5 packets of loose papers, each wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. As we opened them up, we found letters addressed to YIVO's New York office, to which we had the answering letters in New York. We found teen autobiographies, and one document after another with YIVO stamps on them. You can imagine our excitement and consternation. We returned to New York, spread the word of our discoveries far and wide, and launched a campaign to have those materials returned to YIVO in New York. The Lithuanians refused. Over the next 3 years, we negotiated one microfilming agreement after another with them, only to have Zingeris and others cancel them each in turn so as to get better terms. Long story short, those materials and everything at YIVO in New York that had originated in Vilna has now been digitized in the last decade, both here and there, thanks to Ed Blank and other generous donors, and is accessible to scholars free of charge on their computers the world over. I left YIVO in the summer of 1992. Really, I was fired by Bruce Slovan because we saw a basic issue differently. Bruce had called for a merger of YIVO with the then nascent New York Jewish Holocaust Museum, which no one on the YIVO board wanted to see happen. I managed in 1988 to talk Bruce Slovan down from that idea. But several months later, the idea surfaced again, not as a proposal for a merger, but as a proposal to relocate, together with the New York Holocaust Memorial Museum, into a building we would both acquire across the street from the Public Theater on Lafayette Street in Greenwich Village. I saw that as a step towards an eventual merger. So did several members of the YIVO board. And I tried to come up with an alternate idea, specifically to bring together YIVO with the Leo Baeck Institute, devoted to the study of German Jewry, and the American Jewish Historical Society, devoted to the study of American Jewry from colonial times to the present, and tried to bring together a kind of Lincoln Center type arrangement where all three institutions would be housed in a single campus, but would continue to operate as separate institutions. When neither the Leo Baeck Institute nor the American Jewish Historical Society agreed, that idea ended up going nowhere for the time being. And in May of '92, Bruce put the question of relocating with the New York Holocaust Memorial to a vote, and a bare majority of the YIVO board voted in favor. I could not bring myself to implement that decision, and a few weeks later, Bruce sat me down and said, "Sam, the board decided. You either have to do it or you have to get out." And I said, "Bruce, you're right." And I left. The cohabitation with the New York Holocaust Museum never happened. A few months after I left, in the run-up to the November 1992 gubernatorial elections, Governor Mario Cuomo gave the New York Holocaust Memorial Museum a piece of land in Battery Park on which to build a museum of their own. The New York Holocaust Memorial Museum people turned around to YIVO and said, "Well, now we don't need you." And YIVO was left on its own. Over the next year, after my departure, Slovan and the other leaders of YIVO cast about for a plan B and eventually decided that my idea had not been such a bad one, and ended up, after years of difficult effort, to create the Center for Jewish History in the year 2000, which until this day holds YIVO, Leo Baeck, the American Jewish Historical Society, as well as the American Sephardi Federation and the Yeshiva University Museum. This, I think, is what Jake was referring to at the outset as my contribution to maintaining YIVO's independence. There was one additional episode where YIVO's independence had to be maintained, and that came in the second decade of the current century. In 2011, YIVO managed to retire the mortgage on the center building, thanks to very generous donations from many people, led by Bill Ackman and Joseph Steinberg, who made the most generous donations. Steinberg and Ackman took over the chairmanship of the Center for Jewish History in the year that followed, took it over from Bruce Slovan. And in the following 2 years, they put forward a plan to essentially unite the 5 member institutions of the center into a single operational entity with a single board. That too would have changed, if not worse, would have done worse to YIVO's independence. But thanks to the determined efforts of Jake and several other members of the YIVO board, that did not come to pass. In 2014, Joseph Steinberg and Bill Ackman resigned from the center board to pursue their own business and philanthropic interests, as they said. So it was reported in the forward, and the center continues as a successful entity until the present day, with the member institutions having joint efforts in some operations, notably the library, but governed by their own boards with their own missions. I think I should wrap up here and give our audience a chance to ask questions, make comments, and I return it to Jake.
Well, let me start by mentioning one thing, which is COVID, which was a terrible, terrible epidemic all over the world, really woke up YIVO in one way, both Chicago YIVO and certainly National YIVO. The staff there quickly learned about Zooming. And at this point in time, YIVO nationally and we Zoom events all over the world, and we have participants from all over the world. And it's become a renaissance in terms of the educational and the educational messages that we can bring to people. The classes that National YIVO produces are attended by people all over the world. And amazingly enough, the classes that Chicago YIVO Society puts on are attended by people in Canada and other places in North America. So I just wanted to mention that the reach has gone way beyond New York, and there used to be other YIVOs outside of Chicago. We're the only ones that are affiliated besides the one in Buenos Aires. And hopefully we're going to get other YIVOs organized in other cities in the United States and around the world. But Tom, if you'll allow people to ask questions, if you'll unmute them, I'm sure that it'll be more enlightening. No questions. My goodness.
Hello?
Sam, you didn't mention, as I recall, the fact that a Catholic priest hid and saved a number of YIVO books in Lithuania, and that after
Yes. The saving of YIVO materials was a credit to quite a number of Lithuanians who helped out, including a Catholic priest who hid them in his church. But the vast majority of those collections were saved by the head of the Lithuanian book chamber, Antanas Ulpis. He was instructed in 1950 to destroy all Jewish collections. Instead of doing that, he called in his Red Army buddies from World War II who were Jewish and who knew the languages of YIVO's collections, and he asked them to go through these collections and tell him what had to be saved and what could be destroyed. After a couple of weeks of going through those collections, they came back to him and told him that every single piece of paper had to be saved. And he managed to save them at the risk of his own life and that of his colleagues. They hid Yiddish newspapers in a corner of the monastery that the book chamber was located in, former monastery. They piled other Lithuanian newspapers in front of the Yiddish newspapers and said, we just haven't gotten around to cataloging all those papers. We'll do it eventually. And they did it. They hid those papers in that way. They hid thousands of books, thousands of newspapers and documents. When those books were revealed in 1989, people in Vilna were put to work, were hired to work, most notably Fira Brumson, who led the effort, were hired to work in cataloging what had been found. And thanks to Fira and thanks to several others, we were able to learn what had been saved. We were able to smuggle out some documents that had been part of Herman Kruk's diary of the Vilna Ghetto, which was published by YIVO republished by YIVO in the 1990s in a much expanded edition. The first edition had been published in the early 50s in the YIVO Blätter, but in the 1990s, YIVO published a much expanded English edition of it, translated by Benjamin and Barbara Harshav. And that is today the most important document from the Vilna collections, from the Vilna period of ghetto that scholars have.
I don't want to hog the conversation, but a great number of the people who worked in Lithuania and are continuing to work in Lithuania are not Jewish.
Right.
Some of them have learned Yiddish to work on these documents. Over the last 10 years or so, YIVO's had a remarkably warm relationship with the Lithuanian community. And I think that they are coming to terms with the contribution to Lithuanian history that 500 years of Jewish existence in Lithuania was there. And I give them a great deal of credit for that.
I totally
Jeffrey,
agree.
I think you can unmute. Did you have a question, Jeffrey Mallow?
No, I just wanted to unmute. Because other people are muted and I'm not sure that they can be unmuted.
Okay.
I'll say hi, Sam.
Hi.
Okay.
I'm
Good to
looking
see
at
you,
the
Jeffrey.
chat box, and we have a 70-something person in Alaska who owes her successful Yiddish studies to YIVO and to Zoom. Well, I'm tickled pink that you're here from Alaska.
Can I ask a few questions? It's Naomi from Toronto.
Please do.
I had my hand up. I have a few questions, but I'll minimize them. I have a lot of questions. I'm just wondering, I know there was many other, I guess, arguments or points of view about YIVO. I'm just wondering if about Yudel Mark and Weinreich and Mordechai Schechter about, I don't know, the Yiddish, the orthography. I know they each had their own grammar, or even Yudel Mark started a dictionary. I'm a little bit familiar with that. And I also want to know why Mordechai Strigler, who was an editor of the Forward for, I don't know, about 10 years, 12 years.
Right.
He just passed away the year before I came to do my YIVO summer program in 1999. I think it was, yeah, not 99. I'm just wondering why nothing has been translated of his writing. And somebody said to me, you know, he was religious. He was a rabbi. He was religious. He was Zionistic. And I'm just wondering if there's sort of the ideology of the Bundist, Abkahan, and a restriction of what people choose to teach or translate or scholarship. I'm just wondering about the ideology, because I know you talk about Bundist, and I think maybe you are a Bundist, and I know Abkahan. My mother's father was a great nephew to Abkahan. Abkahan went to my mother's parents' engagement party. I think it was 1930 or 1931. So we have a picture, but I don't know anything about Abkahan's family, either
Okay.
from his autobiography. He writes nothing about family, like a
Yes.
love of family, connection, who's who, like a geological. I'm looking for a geological history of his family, and I know I can read about his ideology. And the other thing I wanted to ask, sorry, this will be my last question. Abraham Sutzkever, his Die Goldene Kite, right? I'm just wondering if anyone knows why it is not uploaded at the Yiddish Book Center, or like it's not available anywhere, like online. Is that because of legal issues with the family? I'm just wondering why it's not at the Yiddish Book Center. Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Naomi, it's good to meet you, and to get a first sense of your yichus. I can't speak to the last question that you asked, but let me try to speak to several of the others. The fight over the Stimme Aleph between Max Weinreich and Yudel Mark. Yudel Mark edited the great dictionary of the Yiddish language, the Große Wörterbuch, and he insisted on retaining the Stumme Aleph, meaning the silent Aleph, at the beginning of many, many words in Yiddish. The word Yiddish, for instance, used to begin with an Aleph, followed by Yud Yud, Daled Yud Shin. But because the Aleph at the beginning was silent, Weinreich insisted on dropping the silent Aleph and spelling it Yud Yud, Daled Yud Shin. Mark ended up producing 4 volumes of the Great Dictionary, 4 volumes each the size of what used to be the Manhattan phone book. And those 4 volumes encompassed just the words beginning with Aleph. But the words beginning with Aleph, if you use the Stumme Aleph, comprised about 1/3 of the entire lexical content of Yiddish. Mark estimated that the full Yiddish dictionary, which he knew he would never be able to complete, it was a project much like the Oxford English Dictionary, a project of generations. He knew that the Yiddish dictionary in complete form would number 12 volumes. He was only able to produce the first 4. And I should refer you to the opera that Alex Weiser has just composed, just premiered, I think 10 days ago in New York, an opera entitled The Great Dictionary of the Yiddish Language, which beautifully relates the story, the fight between Mark and Weinreich. You asked why Strigler's works have not been translated. Strigler never worked for YIVO. He did submit articles to the Vorwärts for decades, since really the 1950s, until he became editor of the Vorwärts in 1988, after Shimon Weber's demise. And he continued to write. He was, I think, probably the most prolific person I've ever known. He was editor of the Vorwärts until his death in May of 1998. He indeed had smicha. He got his smicha in Krakow, and he left the Torah world soon after to become a labor Zionist. And he actually spent the last of the war years in the Majdanek concentration camp. And in 1946, he published the first book about any concentration camp authored by a survivor, a book titled Majdanek, published in Yiddish in Paris. I'm forgetting what other questions you asked.
Abraham Sutzkever, Die Goldene Kite.
Oh, yeah. Sutzkever had a close association with YIVO all through his life. From the Vilna Ghetto days, from even before the Vilna Ghetto days, he was a member of the Pro Aspirantur, the undergraduate courses that YIVO gave in Vilna in the 1930s. He was a published poet and a leader of Jung Vilna, literary movement. And as I mentioned, he and Kaczynski led the Paper Brigade. And I recommend this book by David Fishman, The Book Smugglers, as a very beautifully written and compelling recount of the story of the Paper Brigade and what eventually happened with the materials that they saved, leading up until they were saved in our day. But Sutzkever ended up going to Israel, became the editor of the Goldene Kate, the foremost post-war literary journal in Yiddish, published with the support of the Histadrut, with which Sutzkever continued almost until his death in 2010, I believe. I visited him in Tel Aviv in the 1990s and the 2000 aughts, and we brought him from Tel Aviv to New York in May of 1985 to lead our celebration of YIVO's 60th anniversary. I can't speak to his publications. Those have been issued and reissued in beautiful editions in Israel and in the United States. Other questions?
Yes, I finally have a question. I think actually it's a short story about Yuval Mark and Max Weinreich. When I was living in Israel in 1971, I invited over to my home some Yiddishists, they will remain nameless. And they were partisans of either side. And they got into an argument, not about the Shtuma Aleph, but about whether you should write the Vav as two Vavs for a V, or whether you should write the Vav as V for a V. And I don't remember who said which. Yeah, actually, I do. Someone said, but Mark writes it as Vav, Vav, and he's the greatest living Yiddish scholar. And the other person said, only because Max Weinreich is dead. By the way, the other thing I want to say, Sutskever, I don't know whether you said this, but he was a partisan fighter, and it was a very
Yes, yes.
somewhere carrying a submachine gun.
That's right. That's right. Yes. As for the argument that you recounted that took place in your apartment in Jerusalem, I agree with both of the contenders.
Ist euch gerecht.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
I just want to remind everyone that there's going to be a gala this November in New York celebrating YIVO's 100th. And I believe we're honoring Simon Shema. So if anybody's going to be in New York or wants to come to New York for the gala and support National YIVO, please do. If your plans don't include New York, support Chicago YIVO, because we do a marvelous job here in the Chicagoland area.
The gala that Jake mentions will take place in Manhattan on November 19th. And I look forward to seeing many of you there.
Yeah, and if people aren't aware of the National YIVO website, it has an unbelievable wealth of information there. The links, YIVO is busy digitizing information, putting it up on the website. Encyclopedias there, all kinds of other things, archival material is there. And I encourage everybody to check out their website. There's just, but you could spend a lifetime going through the material that's there.
Absolutely right.
So if I don't hear any other questions, Sam, I want to thank you. Sam has just been, such an important player both in YIVO and in the forward. And I value our friendship, and I thank him for his involvement in both of these organizations. There's a rumor that he's working on a memoir, and I am anxiously awaiting it's being done because he's such a wealth of knowledge, information, contacts, memories of the Yiddish world in the United States and what that world remembers of and honors of the world before it. So I want to thank you very much personally and for all of us.
Glad to help, Jake. I don't know if everybody knows, but Jake is the incoming chair of the YIVO board. It's now official, and I look forward to helping in whatever way I can.
Yes, one of my missions is to try to plan a 2- and 5-year plan for the future of YIVO. There's a lot more things that we can do nationally, including to grow our presence in other cities outside of Manhattan. So I'm honored and I'd like to do that. I'm very happy to do that. Sam, sei mir gesinnt und stark. And I thank everybody who attended and have a wonderful, beautiful day.
And a good gesund Jahr.
Dank.